Welcome to Module 2, Accounts Payable for Microsoft Dynamics SL 2015. In this module, we're going to cover the setup screen. So what do you need to think about as you're setting up accounts payable? Secondly, we'll go into the maintenance screens. What are the maintenance items that need to be set up for accounts payable before you can start using it? Next, we're going to go to the input and process screen. So we're going to kind of go through the flow. What do you enter? What gets processed and so forth? And then we're going to end up in the inquiries and reporting sections. How do I get the information out and view the information once it's in accounts payable? So the first screen we're going to cover is the accounts payable setup screen. So let's first start off with the accounts payable account information tab. Now, what you're going to see here in a lot of setup screens, which makes sense, is what are the default values that you need to set up? So when you're doing payables, when you're doing checking, when you're doing expenses or prepayments, what are those default accounts that you need to set up in the system? Now, like all good defaults, it means that you can change this later in the payables module. So when you open up a payable screen, it will use these defaults to go ahead and automatically load them. But you do have the ability inside of the product to be able to change them at certain screens. So you're not locked into them. But of course, it's going to make data entry a lot easier if you default information in that you know is valid before you move forward with that. The next section at the bottom is how we're going to post to general ledger. In the previous modules, we talked about general ledger and having your account and all that information in there. One of the things as you're in a ledger that's actually, in a module that's actually feeding general ledger is we need to tell what needs to go there. Can we summarize everything that goes there, or do you want all the details, all the information to flow from payables over to the general ledger? The next section that we have is the other options area. You see a lot of information here. Let's kind of walk through some of the things that we learned about in general ledger and how this kind of relates here to the payables. First, we have our current period for accounts payable. Much as we had in general ledger, you can have a different period, and this tells us currently what period we're at. The next areas is we have some information on retention, as we spoke of before in general ledger. The idea of that, how many years do you want to retain history, and how many periods do you want to retain transactions. Also at the bottom of here, periods to check for duplicates. What it can do for you is as you're entering in your payables, if you're writing a check to the same vendor again, it can do a double check and make sure, hey, wait a second, are you sure that you did not already cut this check in the past? It's a nice little bit of information there. The next, as we had over in the general ledger, we have the idea of a batch. We'll go into more details if you want to learn more about that, but we'll talk about the idea of a batch, and that each module will have its own batch numbering system, and here we have one right here. We also have the ability of defining the last reference number used. So what is that reference number? Again, reference numbers help us keep track of transactions as they flow from different modules to the other. The next area that we'll talk about is there's a bunch of defaults, and these will make a lot more sense once we actually open up the vendor maintenance screens. But the defaults on when you're opening up a vendor or setting up a vendor, how should they act, what things should default in, and so forth. And these will make a lot more sense once we go ahead and open up the vendor maintenance screens, but things like terms and how we view things. The next section on the right-hand side is the aging categories, your past due and until due. Usually those values are going to be the same, but it allows you to set up what your past due values are going to be. Some are used on reports, on aging reports, and some are run on cash requirement reports that let you know that if you're going to be making all these payments, do we have enough cash to go ahead and support that? So with that, let's go on to our next tab, which is our 1099 tab. Now the idea of a 1099 tab is that we would have inside of the information for a vendor is whether they're a 1099 vendor or not. Now some are and some aren't. Some of the new functionality that's available in Dynamics SL is to be able to, of course, set your limits of what your 1099 vendor should be, what the current 1099 year. But some of the new items here allow you to actually set up backup withholdings. Now the idea of a backup withholding is that, well, the vendor has not given you all the correct information. Maybe they don't give you the correct TIN number or a partial TIN number being your tax ID number. And you want to be able to set up it in the system that, hey, if we do have some information that's wrong, we want to be able to automatically create a backup withholding and set it up to go to a certain account. So these are some niceties, but of course, the nice thing about this is it's automatically calculating this for me. I don't have to think, okay, is this person valid or not? It's going to do all that stuff for you. So some great setup information around there. So the next section we're focused on is that's the setup. So you notice there's a lot of basic information, some nice defaults, but now we're going to actually get into some of those maintenance screens. The maintenance screens being the things that we're going to set up to start using the module. Things you would expect, like vendors. Obviously, if we're doing payables, we need to pay someone. What goes along with those things, like setting up terms, what are the terms we're setting up with our vendors, anything tax-related, as well as some default information around our vendor class type of idea. So we'll go ahead and let's take a look at the vendor maintenance screen and talk to you about some of those values there. I'm going to switch over here back into Microsoft Dynamics SL. And again, the first thing we'll look at the fact is we do have a vendor ID. Now, much like we had over in the General Ledger module, when we have certain ID set up, we can set up what their valid values are, we can set up their lengths and so forth, so that information is available to us. Like we had in the other areas of Dynamics SL, lookup list, just as a refresher, is your F3 key. Will allow you to do a lookup list to be able to find that specific vendor. You can do searches based on IDs and any other fields that you display, but it allows us to quickly find that vendor so we can start looking into their information. Next, of course, we have their name that goes along with the vendor and the terms. Now the terms, I'll do a lookup list on that. We can see all the different type of terms that you can define. And while we're in here, let's talk about terms and talk about how those are set up. Now terms can be used in payables. Terms are also used in receivables. And you have the ability to set up in the system whether this type of term only applies to a vendor or only applies to a customer. So on the screen, we see that we have that option to either apply it to both a customer or vendor or just one or the other. In this case, it's 210 net 30, which we can see down at the bottom. The number of days due is going to be 30. So we have the ability to set up the terms, again, and choose exactly where we want to use them, whether we're using them in payables or in receivables. After that, this particular database we're logged into has one currency, which is base currency, but if we had the ability and needed to do something different, we have that information here as well. On the right-hand side, we have our balances, which is going to show our current balance and future balance, as well as the last time we had a voucher against this vendor, as well as the last time we cut a check. We also have a Show History button, which is going to show us the history of information for this particular vendor. We can see for the last 3 periods that we've been doing some items around purchasing, which is another module in Microsoft Dynamics SL. We see some payments, discounts taken. We see debit adjustments as well. And it allows us to show kind of a little snapshot view of all we've done with this current vendor in this current fiscal year. We also have the ability to see if you have done any backup withholdings for this particular vendor. We can get a little high-level view to see, yes, there was some things, so we could drill into the details to find out a little bit more about them. The next area is up at the top. We do have the ability to set up a class. Now, for the vendor ID, we have the ability of setting up what are those default values that you want to set up, because you might have different types of classes. In this example here, we have one called trade vendor, intercompany vendor, so something internally or employee, but we can have as many different vendor classes as we like. If I click on the edit button, basically all you're doing is defining an ID and a description and then setting up what those default accounts should be. Again, it's a nicety to be able to set up classes for one purpose, to help make setting up vendors quicker. So if we know that for trade vendors, these are the accounts and sub-accounts that we want to set up. But also for reporting-wise, it's great to be able to say, yep, this is one type of vendor. So it makes us be able to set up that information quite nicely. The next tab is the address information tab, where you're going to have your main and remittance information. The way it's set up is we put in the main address for that vendor and we can use our copy button to set it over to remittance. Now the remittance is what will be used when we actually cut that check, so make sure that that value over here is valid and is up to date with the latest and greatest information. The next tab we have is the defaults tab. Within defaults tabs you can set up information whether they are a vendor that they're going to be taking tax from, and whether it's based on the address that they're set up or whether it's just based on the vendor themselves. And you can set up multiple tax IDs. Do a lookup on that tax ID. We can see we can have multiple tax IDs out there. Let's take a look at this one as an example. And within the tax ID area, we're able to set up what is the rate and what is the ID and description. Now beyond that, there's additional things you can set up that regards a lot of the different modules within inside of Dynamics SL, whether it's our sales order management module, our purchasing module, other areas. You have information you can set up additional information, but the basic information needed, of course, is that this is the ID and this is the rate that we'll be using for this particular item. We have the ability to set up multiple ones if needed. Other information across on the right-hand side, we do have some information on accounts and sub-accounts. As we talked about with our class ID, it is defaulting in the ones that were set up for this particular vendor class, but of course we have the ability to go ahead and make changes to that as well. The next tab that we have here is the 1099 information. Now, as I spoke of earlier, the idea of a 1099 vendor is that you're going to be getting a tax ID number with them that you're going to set up in the system. And so when we come into this screen, we'll see that we have the ability to say whether they are a 1099 vendor or not. That lets us know that, yes, we should be checking or not. But some nice things as well is, along with setting them up as a 1099 vendor, is to set what is that default box that should be set if we do enter something against this vendor. And it will default in. Again, you can change it, but you have that default set up for you. Next, another important set of fields is whether we want to make sure that we're doing a backup, calculating a backup withholding, meaning this particular customer or vendor, this vendor is having an issue and they don't have their full tax ID number. Let's say I just have a couple of the characters of it and I don't have it set up. Well, that's enough to let me know that I need to actually start taking some backup withholdings. Now below the setup information of what should the default tax ID and whether we're doing backup withholdings, at the bottom of the screen we are able to view what are our tax totals for this particular vendor for the current and the next 1099 year. And we can see the values that have been accrued across that. So we have that ability to view that here and make sure everything looks good and be able to look into more details if something doesn't look correct or potentially something was in a wrong box. Now, as I mentioned, that obviously as a vendor type of product, vendor maintenance screen, obviously you'd be doing purchasing things against it. So we do have some defaults. The default information here, again, works with our purchasing module to, again, make things easier for you when you're doing your data entry into the purchasing module by defaulting in core information that's generally associated with this particular vendor. The next tab that we have here is the Documents tab. Now, across the top of the screen, we have the ability to go ahead and select whether we want to see documents for all companies or a specific company. So you can see those changes the information below in the grid. We also have that high-level information that we saw before about last vouchering dates and current balances. We also have the ability to determine exactly what we want to see below. Do we want to see all documents, just the open documents, or current plus open? So you have the ability to select exactly what you'll see. And what you're going to see below, of course, are things like vouchers and checks that we've cut or any discounts that apply. So we're going to be able to view that information in there. And if you need to get a little bit more details on one of these specific line items, all you need to do is select one of them, click on the Documents button, and that'll take you to what we call our Document Maintenance screen. Now, the Document Maintenance screen is good to view basically a lot of the information that's going to be coming through your payables modules. You can pull up different documents that are out there. It allows us a quick way to view how things have been entered into the system. So in our Document Maintenance screen, I know we haven't jumped into the actual entering of vouchers, but it does give me a high-level view of the specific document and all the detailed lines of the accounts and sub-accounts that were entered against here. So again, the document screen gives us a lot of great information, a good place to start if we want to find something and drill back to the details. Now there are also other features here in the vendor maintenance screen which go along with one of our other modules, the purchasing module. And we'll talk a little bit more about these features later in the receivables, when we're talking about receivables. But there are two features just to mention real quickly. I think I'll jump to a slide here to talk to you about those. So one of the things that just to recap what we talked about before I talk to you about that is first, again, vendor maintenance screen, just some informational purposes. The ID is characters of 15 characters, so you can go up to 15, can be as short as you like. We talked about the term maintenance screen and about being able to use term maintenances for both your customers or vendors. We also set up the information about vendor maintenance information. One item that I didn't catch, and I'm glad to actually pick this up here now, is there is a checkbox here called separate checks. Now the idea is that if we have multiple vouchers that are sitting out there for this particular vendor, do you want to cut a separate check for every single voucher, or do you want to keep them all together? And that's one important item when you're setting up your vendor. When you go to print your checks, that'll obviously influence whether things show up, how they show up on your checks. Again, we talked about the fact that the address information and the remittance being important because that's going to show up on your checks. Again, we talked about the defaults around tax and also for accounts and sub-account defaults, as well as our tax maintenance. Again, we also talked about our vendor class maintenance, which gives us the defaults, and the real idea here is that we're setting up defaults for all the different accounts that can be set up in the vendor maintenance screen. As well as our 1099 setting up of the default boxes, as well as whether we're going to do backup withholdings. Our lovely document screen, which shows you all that information we just talked about. And the last thing I want to talk about is our quick send and doc share features. Now, what we have is two bits of functionality that are nice if you're using this with other modules. So for example, if you are using the purchasing module, what it will allow you to do is interact directly with your vendor. So when you're in the vendor maintenance screen, you can click on one button and it'll automatically email or fax that purchase order right to somebody. Same-wise, inside that same screen, you can also take that document and decide to share it with other people within your company. So let's say you want to keep track of all your documents and you're sick of printing out things, so you actually like to store them up on something like a SharePoint site, which is what we can do with this feature. The doc share feature will allow us to go ahead and automatically save our documents up to a SharePoint site, sharing it either internally or optionally, you can actually share it externally with your vendors as well. So that takes us through our maintenance screen. So we kind of talked about, okay, I've set up accounts payable. I've now set up some vendors that I can start working with. Well, what is the process of actually entering something in that I have actually to pay? So we're going to go through, wow, a long list of screens. We're going to talk vouchers and adjustments. We'll talk about some of the recurring items, which we talked about in general ledger as well. Now that we have our voucher in there, how do I pay it? After I pay it, how do I select if I want to view what's being selected for payment, what's out there, previewing what you're about to print for your checks, actually going ahead and printing your checks and updating your checks. We'll then talk about how do you avoid something once it gets in. If I put a check in and something got upset or messed up, or maybe something didn't go through the processing correctly. We'll talk about our manual check and payment entry process. We'll talk about our quick voucher and prepayment entry screen. We're going to talk about our prepayment applications. We'll talk about quick voucher entry and on the idea of doing distributed entries. We'll talk a little bit about pay when paid, 1099, and some other common functionality that falls across a lot of the Dynamics SL areas. So with that, let's first talk about the general flow. Now things will be different, could be different, but the idea of Microsoft Dynamics SL's accounts payable is that you're going to first start off by entering a vendor's voucher. So this is something that we need to pay. The next, if we look on the screen, we're going to select the voucher for payment. So, okay, makes sense. I put it in the system. Now it's time to actually pay it. So now I need to select it for payment. The next is I'm going to go ahead and print the check. And then if we're okay and everything went through, we're then going to keep the check. Now, that's the general idea. Of course, things can change. You can come in at different spots in this process. But just to kind of give you the whole general idea of how things flow when you're doing something in payables. Now, the next thing is in the general ledger screen, we talked about the idea of batch, and it's kind of been expanded here in the payables, as you will also learn about in the receivables area as well. And the idea of a batch is that a batch can have, in this case, multiple documents within it. So it could have one document that we're paying for a vendor. It could have 50 different documents that are associated to a batch. So a batch can be as large or as small as you want it. But just to understand that idea, that's a batch, and a batch can have one or more documents inside that batch. What determines what the different batches are is that reference number that we've talked about in General Ledger. Reference number is important to us because that keeps us knowing exactly internally what is the reference number that we're using for this particular voucher. The next is that with each document, you can have detail lines. You could have multiple detail lines in the system. So you could have multiple accounts and sub-accounts that are things that are being entered against, multiple line items. So it's important to kind of understand that idea of a batch. That again, at the very high level, you're going to have a batch ID. Within that batch, you're going to have one or more documents that are associated to that batch, and then you'll have multiple detail lines. Those are the accounts and subaccounts that you're actually hitting. So that's very important because that's kind of what we use kind of universally throughout the Microsoft Dynamics SL product, the idea of a batch with many or multiple documents in it and then with multiple detail lines. So with that, let's go ahead and let's jump into the voucher and adjustment entry screen, and let's actually jump in there live. So I'm going to jump back into the Dynamics SL screen. And as we've talked about in previous modules, we have the idea of different areas, and so we're going to start in the input area. What are the things that we can enter into the accounts payable module? So the first thing we're going to start with is our voucher and adjustment entry screen and kind of walk through that process. Now the first thing we talked about is we've got a batch number which that will automatically get assigned to us. And I'll pull up one that we just happen to have sitting here so we can walk through this idea. So I've got a batch, that number is automatically assigned. I can always do an F3 and do a lookup to find out what the valid values are. We've got our period to post, the ability to, again, it's going to default to whatever the current one is, but if we need to post a different one, we can change that. As we've talked before in the general ledger module discussion, the idea of what do we want to do with it. We're on hold, we want no action, or we're ready to release these items and let them flow through the accounts payable module and then eventually post to the general ledger module. Idea of our control total, again, how many line items, how many items are in the batch, how many documents, we need to know what the totals are. And this is kind of a nice way to verify that when you're doing your data entry, that when I'm done putting all my documents into the system, I can quickly add them up together and say the total should be 945 or whatever value it is. That gives me a great way before I go forward to know exactly what's going on. So what we're seeing there is the batch information, and you're going to see that across a lot of the different modules. The idea of a batch, what is my handling, and what's the control total for that batch, something to understand that when we're putting our documents in, we have those information in there first before we can actually go ahead and release those batches. Now the next part we're going to look at is we're looking at that document center I talked about, the document area. So if we go, you see the header right here, document, and what's going to be in here is we're going to get a reference number. Now we talked about the reference numbers being important and automatically being assigned. That one's been automatically set for me as I went ahead and saved this previously. We can talk about the different types of entries. Now the voucher entry, I'm going to go ahead and put a voucher entry in for me to be actually go ahead and pay. But of course, you also have the options to debit or credit against that voucher as well. We then select our vendor. Again, doing the lookup list, I can either do an F3 here. It's just going to show me what the valid vendors that are in the system for me to be able to choose from. We then have the date, which can be today's date, and we also have the invoice date. So that's been given to us. We got the invoice from the vendor. We're entering into the voucher and adjustment entry screen, and here's the information we were given. The next section we have, you can see there's a series of 5 different text tabs right here. The first one we have here is the terms. We talked about terms on the vendor maintenance screen. It defaulted in because it looked at that vendor ID and said, yep, that's the terms that have been defined. But of course, we are free to make a change if there's a need to put a different term value in there. We've got our amount that I put in here for this particular item. It automatically, based on the discount that was set up, it automatically calculated that for me. It's then showing me information about the company that I'm logged into and what we're getting ready to move forward with this. If I was using the purchasing module, we have a series of fields that will allow me to understand exactly if this is for a particular PO. And then the important things we have over here are our discount date, so the date that we've been told that if we go ahead and pay it by, we can take advantage of that discount, the due date, and the pay date. And the due date and pay date will get set for us based on our terms that we have set up, and they will be automatically set for us. The next section in this document section, so just real briefly, we're getting a ref number. We're generally going to get a vendor ID, maybe set what the invoice date is, and then put in the total amount that we've got from them. Now, if our due dates and pay dates aren't being set, we can go, of course, we're able to override them, but they're generally going to be based on the vendor defaults, so we can make those items. Now, generally, when you're entering a process, you'd be done, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of these other options that you have as well. Now, we do have some abilities, some default information, usually landing around some of the other modules that interact with it. For example, if we're using the project controller module, what is the default project that's going to be used for this particular entry? So we have some ability if we're doing the idea of assigning things to If we have a master document and a doc type associated to this, we have the ability to view that information as well. Next, we have the overrides. If you remember in the payable setup, we said what should be the default AP account and sub-account. That's going to come right into here, either based on our vendor or based on our setup screens. Again, we talked about the fact that if you need to change it, that is available for you to do as well. The next option here is for our manual check and payment screen. So if you do happen to have someone coming right in here, it's going to default in the checking accounts that's been set up for you. And you have the ability, if you need the ability to enter in a manual check right away, meaning that we've got it right here and I need to go ahead and move forward, that you have the ability to do that right in this tab as well. Last tab, the Apply Adjustment tab, allows us to apply adjustments, and we'll talk to another option for us to apply at a later time. So again, we've talked about the batch. We've got the information of the document. Again, general data entry, you're going to be putting in that information about who the vendor is, the total amounts. And then you've got a lot of different tabs that give you different options to go outside of quote-unquote the norm, if you want to call it that, of processing. Now, back to the screen. Now we have our detail line items. Again, we can choose exactly a couple things. We can choose different companies. So I've got multiple companies defined in here. I could be doing this for another company. I have that ability to change the company at the line item level. The line type, whether it's going to be an invoice, which generally will be, but you have the option if it happens to be a miscellaneous charge or a freight. Again, it's going to default to the account when I put it into a system that has been set up for me, or I can choose that account. I can then go through and enter as much information or not. Now, because this is a payables module, things will be coming from things like a purchasing module, and will flow into here. So you could get into the details of having exactly the unit, having the quantity, the unit price, extended cost, or if you just need to record the total amount, you're not really interested in that, you have the flexibility to do one or the other. So we have all the information. If this was a 1099 vendor, this is where the information would have defaulted into, saying that he was a 1099 vendor, and we want to go ahead and have his default box sent. If it was coming from the inventory module, we would have an inventory ID and a description associated with that inventory ID. We also have the ability to choose tax categories and tax IDs based on what we've set up in the system. And also we have the ability for things that come from other modules. So if it was the employee ID or labor class coming from other modules like project controller, we have that information to view as well. So as we're looking at our invoices, we have the general information that can be entered into the detail as well. Now once we're done with this, we do have the ability to go ahead and release it. So we'll go ahead and release this batch. It's going to ask me something. This is new in accounts payable. You didn't see this in general ledger, but the idea of, do we want to add another document to this entire batch, or we're done with the batch and we want to go ahead and start over? So that is something to notice, is that you will see this screen, and it's basically asking you, do you want to add another document to this batch, or do we want to go ahead and finish this batch? So we go ahead and it releases the batch for us, and it is ready for us to go ahead and move forward with it. Let's go back to the slides and talk about this to kind of recap on some of those things that we talked about. Again, the batch idea, the document, and the details. One of the other items that we can do, just as we talked about in general ledger, is, do you have a recurring voucher? So something that you're paying to a vendor on either a period basis, a quarterly basis, whatever you have. So in this particular case, we're saying here, the idea behind a recurring is that you need to specify things like the cycles and the number of cycles. So for in this case here, we said that the cycle is 1, meaning in this case 1 period, every period, and that for the next 6 cycles, which in this case would be the next 6 periods, we want to create this exact recurring voucher, something that we're going to pay them over and over for 6. Now you could, of course, up that amount to whatever value you need. But basically, when you're setting up your recurring voucher, you're setting your cycles, your number of cycles, your due date and pay dates, and the total amount. And then you're going into the detail lines to tell us exactly which account and sub-account and the total amount that should be put against it. Then we'll see later here, we have the ability to go ahead and generate those recurring vouchers at a later date, which is run through the Generate Recurring Voucher screen. Now, when there's something available for you, it will display and say, yep, you haven't run it for this current period, or something's available. So the Recurring Voucher screen allows us to see that information, see that there's one is available for us, and we click on the Begin Processing button, which is going to go ahead and generate that recurring voucher for us. Now that means that that voucher is created. It's created in what we call a posted status. And the posted status in Dynamics SL lets us know that it's available and it's ready to be posted and it's ready to go to the general ledger. So when it's created in a posted status, this means it's ready, and the next step we can do is actually go ahead and pay for it. So kind of an important thing. So back here is now that we've got our vouchers in, and we've talked about setting up a vendor and I've entered a voucher against them, how do I actually go ahead and start paying them? And what we're going to look at now is something called the payment selection screen. So switching back over to Dynamics SL, if we go to the payment selection screen, what it allows me to do is come into the screen, and some things will default for me automatically. Again, it's looking at my current period to post, saying, yep, that's what you're currently set up for. It's telling me what the default account for my checking account is. Again, if there's another one out here, I've got another one for payroll. If I needed to change it, I have the ability, but it's going to default what's been set up in the system. The next section below the top area is that, okay, what do we want to do? Well, I'm getting ready to cut checks, and I need to tell it the check printing date. So if I said I was getting ready to print checks on a certain date, let's say it's the 12th, 10th of 1999, and then what I'd next tell it is, well, what's that next check printing date? Now what that's going to do is if it finds that there are things that are due between the time that you entered and the time that it's going to go ahead and, when you told it the next time you're actually going to run checks, what that does for it is it allows it to determine, well, should this item be included in the next check run? So we have the first to be able to tell us about the check and the check printing date, and that's going to go ahead and then using the payment selection of pay date, it's going to go out and decide what needs to go ahead. Now, you do have the ability to do it in other ways. You can say, you know what, there's this specific reference number that I want to go out there and I want to pull it up. If we do choose something like a reference number, it enables us to go to the grid and choose a specific value that's out there. So let's say it's this number 74 that I want to run it for, and that allows me to pick specific items that I want to go out and run with. Or I know I only want to pay for one vendor, or I only want to pay for one company. I have that flexibility to go through and do that. Now in my case, I want to actually run it for everything, so we can kind of show you what it's going to look like. Other fields up here, I'm allowed to go ahead and, one of the things we'll see here in a second is once I'm done selecting the things in the batch in the document section, is that the next thing I try to do is I'm going to tell it to begin processing. So what begin processing allows me to do is it says go out and find things that need to be paid. Now once they're there, I can do one of two things. I can go to the preview button, which is going to show me those two items that were sitting out there that are ready to be processed. So these are the two ones that were out there. So that preview lets me see them. The other is I can go ahead and do a view selected, and it'll show me the items that are out there. Now, what's nice about this in the view selected is that you might look at here and go, you know what, this reference number here, that's a lot, and I don't think we are ready to go ahead and cut that. So what I can do is I can delete it out of this particular batch. Now the important thing here is when I'm deleting something out of this screen, I am not actually removing the voucher out of the system. The voucher's still there. I'm just saying when I'm getting ready to release my checks right now, what are the ones that are out there, and do I want to run it with this check? I'm not getting rid of it, so it's still there and available for us to run. Now the next thing, we'll say yes to that. Coming back here, let's say I wanted to go ahead and change my pay date here, and let's go ahead and let it run for a longer period here. And I'll get this to run here. And I hit begin processing again. It looks like I got rid of some of those. So what it allows me to do is I could go ahead and clear them and start all over again. So what I was trying to show here is that if you did and you hit begin processing and you started the process and you went, geez, I didn't know if I really wanted to include that, I want to start over again, you can at any time come back here, go ahead and put some information here, tell it that you want to clear the previous, and hit the begin processing button. And that will go ahead and allow you to bring up different items in the system. So you have that functionality. Now once we have the information in there, some other options before we quit the screen is you do have some advanced select options. So if we want to go through the process of choosing even more granular than using those drop-down boxes for the payment selections, we have that functionality available as well. inside of this advanced select screen. Now, the next step after this is after we've selected it and we've said, okay, we've viewed the selected, we've removed or added, removed the ones that we didn't want to do. The next step is going to go ahead, well, what do we do next? Well, going back here, let's talk about some of the things. We've talked about the fact that we can use the payment selection screen to sort and select and decide exactly which ones we want to pay. We can use the preview, but also more importantly, that edit select screen to be able to choose exactly which items we want to actually run. Again, we're not deleting, it's still going to be there. Now after that, we can run something called a check preview. Now what the check preview is going to allow me to do is see if I ran the checks right now, what are all the checks that are going to be put into this particular batch and what the total amounts are. Now the important thing here obviously is, can we cover paying all these people at this time? So this gives me a quick way to preview it. I can always go back in and make adjustments and say, yep, we need to cut some things out of it. But the check preview allows me to go ahead and see that information. Now after we run the check preview, now that check preview is located right here under the Accounts Payable module under Reports. So we have that check preview report. The next one that we would run is our checks report. And if we go back into the presentation, we'll see that we then go ahead and choose to run our check printing process. Now, what's involved in this process? Well, the first thing you need to do is obviously let us know what the check date that you want to print out on the checks are. You then choose that batch that you created in the Edit Select Payment check screen, and it's going to go ahead and say, okay, what batch number do you actually want to process? The next step after that is it's going to calculate and see what is that next check number that needs to run, and it allows you to go ahead and select it and run and print out your checks. Once your checks are printed, you are going to be faced with the following screen. And the question comes to you, how'd that check run go? Was everything good? Did the paper get jammed? Something happen in the process? Did the power go out? What happened? So what's going to happen is it allows us to go in here and do a few different options here. The first one is delete all. Delete all says basically we need to reprint using the previously used check numbers, meaning I need to get rid of it. It happened, yeah, but something went wrong and I need to go ahead and delete those. Now, what we'll do, it will use the old check numbers to reprint again so that if you were not using stock check, this will work for you. But if you are using stock check, meaning that your check numbers are already pre-printed, what you're going to do, and if something goes wrong, you're going to want to run the void all. So it's going to keep the check numbers and is used so it doesn't try to reuse those numbers. So if it, in our case, if it printed check 1 and check 2, we're going to tell it, keep those, yep, we're using pre-printed stock, let's go ahead and start with 3 and 4, and it'll keep that. Again, that's your delete all and void all. Now the other is that you can go ahead and keep all of them. Saying, yep, I want to keep all the checks that were entered, everything went through perfectly, no problems right now, go ahead, proceed as normal. You can also have another option of being able to select by check, so if you need to go through and choose exactly what you want to do. And then the other option that you have on the screen is to go ahead and print your remittance. So if you need to print remittance as well, you have the ability to run it right from the AP check update. Now there's another scenario that I kind of want to talk about, and that's the fact that if you do put a voucher into the system and you decide that, you know what, we really didn't mean we need to take some amount off of it, we need to remove it. If there is a voucher in the system, maybe whether it has a small amount that you want to write off or you actually want to go ahead and just get rid of it completely, you do then have the ability to put in a debit adjustment. So just to talk about this scenario, this is a common question, is how do I get rid of that? And the way that we do it in the system is that if you have your voucher in the system and you were entered in error and you want to close that voucher, you can enter in a debit adjustment for the exact same amount. And then what you do is you actually select both of those items when you're doing our payment selection process. So when we go into payment selection, we're going to choose the voucher and we're going to choose the debit. And the process of actually printing the checks kind of marries those two together. So what we'll do is we'll print out something that we consider what we call a $0 check, which does mean a check with no value on it. But what that does is that removes the balance from the voucher and applies that debit to the voucher. So just a different concept to kind of understand how that works here when we want to go ahead and debit the amount that's against that's a voucher that's currently out there. Now, other things that might happen. What if you need to go ahead and do a void check entry? So when we go into void check entry, What it allows us to do is we're creating the idea of a batch again. We're going through giving it our statuses, but the main process that you're going to do is go through and be able to choose a previous check that's out there. So here's all the checks that have been entered into the system. I can choose one of those checks, give it a void date. It's going to show me just to validate that, yep, that's exactly the one that I want to void. We can go ahead and put our total amount and go ahead and release this. Now this gives us the ability, if we needed to void a series of checks or just one check, this will allow us to void a check and then make that voucher available to be paid at a later time. The next is the quick voucher and prepayment entry screen. Now the idea between the quick voucher and the prepayment entry screen is that you're going to enter one voucher and you're going to be cutting a check in one screen. So I showed you the process that you have to enter your voucher in, you need to go ahead and release it, you need to go then through the payment selection screen, select it, and then you're going to go ahead and then do a check preview and then run the checks. The idea here is that maybe your vendor has requested a prepayment before the invoice is even received, and you need to be able to go ahead and cut that check, enter the voucher and cut that check all at one time. So if we go back into the quick voucher and adjustment entry screen, or sorry, quick voucher and prepayment screen, you're going to see a lot of the similar fields that we've seen on other screens. Again, you're going to be specifying the vendor, we're going to go ahead with that vendor, we've got his ID, we can go ahead and give it an invoice number that they've given to us. We go through and put our amounts. It's for $50. We can, again, override things if needed be, if we need to change the actual AP account it's going to be using. And then we just go into the detail area and put in the exact amount that we're putting in here. Again, the big difference here being that when I go in and I actually put in my amount, there we go, put in my amount, and I can go ahead and save this. Oops, I forgot to put something in there. All right, we'll go through and enter this. Let's make a change to our account real quick. All right, and then when we go through the system and put in our dollar amounts and we save our quick voucher entry, we can go ahead and choose to release it. Now when we go ahead and release it, we then have the ability, after it releases, is right from the screen. We don't have to start the whole process. We can start right from the screen, bring that guy up. It's going to be in that backup withholdings. You can see I left that setting on there, so it's warning me about that, which is good. And then I can go ahead and print and keep the check right from this screen. So it's going to go ahead and say, yep, here's the checking account, here's the next checking number, here's the check date, boom, continue. And what that would allow me to do is to go ahead and print my check right from this screen. I don't have to go through that other process. So I told you there is a flow, but of course there's sometimes you need the ability, as in this screen, the quick voucher screen, that you need to do it right now, get it into the system, do a prepayment, whatever it has to be done. So you can do it right through this screen. Jump back into there. So again, quick voucher and prepayment entry screen, same idea, but again, giving to you in one screen in case you need to quickly go ahead and cut that check. The prepayment application screen, the idea with the prepayment application screen is that you might have multiple prepayments that you need to apply against a single voucher. One of the things that have been added to the Dynamics SL 2015 release is that when you're in a screen, like the voucher and adjustment entry screen, you now have the functionality that if someone put in multiple prepayments into the system, let's go pull up an existing one that might be out there. In the past, you could only apply one, but this is a great new feature that allows us to apply multiple prepayments against this voucher in case you happen to have that need. Possibility, the idea that the vendor needs you to pay multiple times before they even start moving forward with the item. The next one is around voucher entry for distributed liability. So the idea behind this voucher entry distributed liability screen is that you might be doing centralized cash and distributed liability. The idea that you have multiple companies set up in your system, one being the main company, and then you have maybe multiple subsidiary companies out there as well. The idea is that that main company, they pretty much control the cash, but they want to be able to transfer the responsibility for payables to all the subsidiaries. So similar ideas, you see a lot of the same fields, but using this voucher entry screen here, I can then go into the details and specify them to go out to specific different companies with inside of here as well. So again, used if you're using the idea of distributed liability and using the idea of centralized cash. Now there's also, obviously as you would think, within inside of when you're actually cutting checks is that you need to be able to reconcile those checks. Now we'll talk about a module a little bit later here called Cash Manager, which actually does most of our reconciliation, but you do have that functionality built inside of here as well. So inside of Payables, we can go through, pull up our past checks and choose to clear them or to not clear them. So again, generally this is done in another module, which we're going to be going through here in a little bit, but you do have if you're not using the other modules, you do have that ability to go ahead and do that inside the screen as well. Now another feature with inside of Dynamics SO is called the Pay When Paid feature. And the idea with Pay When Paid is that a lot of times nowadays we're working with subcontractors or people that are doing work for us. And the idea is that you could connect a payables document to a receivables document. So I am not going to pay this subcontractor for the work that we're working on until I actually receive payment from the receivables from that customer. So with inside of the accounts payable module is the ability to first go out and search for that vendor, find that particular item that we're supposed to be paying, and then find that associated item on the customer side of the world. So you see on the left-hand side screen shot where we're able to choose the two and see, yep, I need to link this guy up with him. Now what this is going to do is when you go into the payment entry screen or payment selection screen, when you go to select an item for payment, you're not going to see items that are tied to items that haven't been paid. So for example, if I haven't paid for this customer hasn't paid me yet, it's not going to show up. And that's great, so you can keep on track and not pay people that you haven't been paid for. So again, the idea is we have the ability to link them. We have the ability to view and see what's been linked up together, but we also have the ability to break those links. If at a later time you get a balance down to a very low value, it's a matter of dollars or cents, you can break that and you can go ahead and allow you to pay them. So it's not permanently, but it's a nice way to link things together. The next area that we have is around 1099s. And the idea of a 1099 we've talked about already, but with inside the module you have the ability to change your 1099 year. So you can send what the current year is and what the next year is and which ones are open and which ones are closed. So you have the ability to change the status of those years and change the status of your 1099 processing. As we talked about in the vendor maintenance screen, you can set up what the default values will be for that vendor. We saw in the voucher and adjustment entry screen where the default value would come in, but also where we can make a change to it as well. Now, once you have that information, you do have the ability to go ahead and do a couple things. You can go ahead and generate, if you're using electronic filing, you have the ability to go ahead and view that information. You can get specific and just choose specific vendors that you want to go and set up also the payer or transmitter and the companies that you want to process when you're doing that. You also have the ability to do a 1099 preview, so you can see your 1099s and preview them first and make sure that they look fine. And then also that we have the ability to support 1099 forms to print them out, so you can actually supply those to the appropriate people. So you have that 1099 processing built right into accounts payable as well. Now some of the items that we talked about in the general ledger, just to kind of reinforce that same functionality here, is we also have some common features, which is, for example, the ability to release accounts payable batches. Now remember the idea of batches, they can go into different statuses based on whether you've decided to do segregation of duties, meaning that I'm in charge of entering all the batches, but someone else needs to review them and post them at a later date. And that's where that release AP batches screen comes in. I can pull it up at any time, see what's out there, and release it at a later time. And we also have our delete detail. And the delete detail allows me to choose, based on my AP setup that we talked about, we can go ahead and choose whether we would like to delete things that are in our database that are older or past a certain date or time. So that is the kind of the process flow. We've kind of touched on a lot of different things, but we've kind of gone through not just the process and input screens, but kind of the flow that would potentially happen at your company. The next section we'll talk about is inquiries and reporting. We'll go over a couple of the inquiry screens for vendors. We'll look at all the reports that are available, and then we'll go and give you some examples of some of the important things like the aged AP, the period sensitive, and the vendor trial balances. And then we'll finalize that with a look at quick query, and we'll look at a couple of quick queries that come out there with the AP documents and AP transactions. So the first one we'll look at is the vendor inquiry. Let's go ahead and jump into that live. So with the vendor inquiry screen, all we need to do is type in the ID or do a look for that particular vendor. And once we load it, it shows us the great general information about this particular vendor for a specific company or for all. The next is going to show us our current and future balances. And if we want to view information about our current balances, we can just click on the magnifying glass and drill into the details. We can see our vendor activity information, so we see all the vouchers, debit adjustments, and other items that have been entered against this particular vendor. Then to get more information, we can click on the document transaction button to take us back, in this case, to the document maintenance, the actual voucher that was entered against for this particular vendor. The other screen that we have out there is our vendor history screen, which is going to go ahead and show us for a vendor for a specific fiscal year, whether it's for a specific company or all, and it's going to show us information about what's been entered against them. Now, of course, since we're in a vendor, it does interact with our purchasing module, so we can see information about that. But we can also see information about payments. We can look about discounts. We can see our debits and any credits that were put against this vendor, as well as being able to see our backup withholdings. So if this person, or this vendor was an exact vendor that had backup withholdings set up, we get a quick view of exactly how many backup withholdings we took against them in a specific period for a fiscal year. The next is a set of reports. Now, of course, along with your reports, you have the ability to, of course, do our check preview and our checks, which we went through earlier. But we also have some maintenance reports like the vendor maintenance screen, which allows you to see exactly what's been set up, or your PO addresses and other information like that. We also have some key reports that you're going to want to run for our 1099 processing, which we talked about in previous screens. But of course, we want to look at some of the transactional reports that are important to us. Now, there are some key things to remember when you're running reports. Certain reports will run for the current period, and certain reports are going to run for prior periods. So that's a kind of a key item to note. So for example, the vendor trial balance and the aged AP reports, they're going to run just for the current period. But when you're running for prior periods, you can actually run the vendor period trial balance or the period sensitive aged AP, and that'll give you information for prior periods as well. So one thing to keep in mind when you're running these reports. Let's take a look at some of these and some of the information you can get. First is your aged AP report. This is basically a snapshot of your current payables. So what's past due and what's the time until due. So it's going to give you a nice look to see exactly where things are sitting and what you need to potentially take action on. The next is your period sensitive aging report. This is a good report to run when you're going to reconcile your accounts payable with your general ledger. Basically, it's giving you the balance at the end of an entered period. So you're saying for this particular period, this is where we stand. What can happen here too is to make sure that all your accounts payables have flowed correctly into your general ledger and that you've posted everything. This will allow you to see those items that potentially may have not posted at this time. We also have our vendor trial balance. Again, this is your current vendor trial balance, showing you basically all your payable activities. So if we look inside, we can see for this company Adventure Works, we can see the items that were entered into there. There's a voucher, a hand check. We can see some adjustments, a zero check, and a check. So you can see all the different options of things that have been entered against it. So it's a good thing to run to see exactly what have we been doing with this particular vendor. And we can specify just to run it for one specific vendor, to run it for a group of vendors, whatever we need to have done. We can view that report and view that information. The next is our vendor period trial balance. Again, same idea, but we're running it to see payable activities that potentially have happened in the past, not just this current period. So it gives us more of a detail of what's been happening for this vendor, so we can go back and see the history of what's been happening with this particular vendor. Now the next thing is to look at some quick queries. Again, quick queries allow us to look at the Dynamics SL data. We can filter, sort, select, thinking things that you would think that you could be doing in an actual report that you'd print out. But the thing I like about this is that we can kind of take it to the next step. We can take this information, take that information and export it out into a quick query and into Excel so we can actually do some looking at the data. So let's go ahead and pull up a quick query. Now, under the quick query module, we have the listing of the different actual items available for us, from our AP documents to vendor information, vendor details, vendor history. So if we open up, for example, our AP documents, we can pull them up and see all the different batches that have been put into the system. Now, if we wanted to see just for one, we can go ahead and say, I just want to see things that are put against this one vendor. So I could type in the value VT0124. And then my screen is automatically updated to just the entries that have been put against the system for this particular vendor. As we talked about before, we can move things around. I can move fields to where I want them. If I don't need something, document description, we don't seem to be using it at our company, so I can go ahead and remove it. Or use our idea of the choose column functionality, which I can go ahead and add and remove fields as I like that are available to me on this report. If I need to do more sorting selecting, I have a whole area down below, which I can go ahead and put additional filters, put multiple filters against this particular view. So I could go ahead and get rid of our VT010, go down to here and say, yep, I only want to see it for this vendor, which contains the value VT, tab off, and then if I need, I can add another one as well. Once I get to the information or find the information, I can drill back to the details for that vendor, so I could drill right back into the vendor maintenance screen or the vendor inquiry screen for this particular person. See the details, drill back to the details, find the voucher that I'm looking for, go back to the original document, and again get back to the information that I need. So quick query is a great place to start, a great alternative to potentially running reports, because it gives you a great way to filter, find the data, get to the data that you need. Now, the last thing that I want to show you on this is that the last thing is always we want to take data and put into Excel. So we do have that functionality. We can do things like creating a query table, which we'll do right now. We can create a pivot table. But either way, we can get the data from Microsoft Dynamics SL's quick query feature, and we can go ahead and put it into an Excel document. So now the data is in there. We can start doing and sorting, selecting. Maybe we only want to see things that are vouchers. We know that VO meets voucher. Update it, and now we've got the information we need. So with the quick query feature, you're able to really kind of take that next step. Reporting is great. Reporting gives you the functionality and flexibility that you need to get to the information, print it out, and present reports to people who need it. But this quick query feature kind of takes it to me to the next level, where we can actually do a lot of the sorting, selecting on the screen, be able to manipulate the way we want it to look by just simply dragging and dropping fields back and forth. And then when we're ready for it, we can actually put it out into Excel. Now, with this quick query, the way that we've built it into this latest version is we can actually make this refreshable. So what that means is once I export the data out to Excel once, we look at the screen, and in Excel it says, yep, I can go ahead, and on the Excel document, I can click refresh, and refresh will allow me to go ahead and automatically update this. This means I don't have to export the data from quick query multiple times. Once I do it once, this refresh button will allow me to do it over and over again as many times as I like. So that's Accounts Payable Module 2. Let's go and talk about what we learned in the Module 2 for Accounts Payable. First thing we talked about is the Accounts Payable setup screen and all the different options that can be set up there. We then looked at a vendor and saw the information that can be set up around a vendor. Next, we entered a voucher for that vendor. And once we put the voucher in for this in the vendor, we talked about how we could actually select that voucher for payment. So we're ready to pay it. Once we did that, we went and looked through a print preview process to look at the checks and see exactly how much money we would be outlaying, so we make sure we understand that. Next, we went ahead and went through the print check process and understanding the fact that we need to, at the very end, tell us, did those checks go through correctly or not? So we're either keeping them, deleting them, or voiding them. And then after we went through that process, we went and looked at some accounts payable reports. We looked at some inquiry screens, some of the key reports that you need to look at when you're looking at your vendor information. And then we ended in the quick query section, where we're able to sort, select, and find that important information in your area of the accounts payable, and then be able to drill back or export that information out to Excel. So that's Module 2, Accounts Payable. Thanks for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in Module 3, Accounts Receivable.